Hello and welcome to this IGD presentation on Brexit. The aim of this presentation is to give grocery industry personnel visibility of IGD's latest strategic thinking on the Brexit issue. And please note that our research on this issue is being shared freely with IGD members and non-members alike, and that's in line with IGD's charitable aim of helping grocery industry businesses to serve the public more effectively. So, the referendum on UK membership of the EU is now over, and the referendum campaign proved to be particularly grueling and ill-tempered, which is really not in character for UK politics, which is generally fairly harmonious and, well, fairly polite. We have a result at last, a result that very few people were able to predict. In the days before the referendum, most of the pollsters were predicting a narrow win for the Remain camp. Now, in fairness to the pollsters, political research is notoriously difficult and very prone to inaccuracy, but I think even so, this outcome must be provoking a certain amount of head scratching amongst the polling organisations. Turnout in the referendum was 72%, and that's actually slightly higher than the average for a UK general election, which is around 70%, and the high level of turnout suggests a high level of engagement amongst the public, even though solid information on the issues was noticeably lacking. However, I do sometimes wonder about the 28% of the voters who actually choose not to turn out on the day. And what on earth were these people up to that they considered to be more important than this referendum? They can't all have been stuck in heavy traffic on the way to Glastonbury, for example. The voting result was 52% in favour of Brexit and 48% against Brexit, and that was much closer than the recent referendum on Scottish independence, where 55% voted against independence and 45% in favour. That decision to leave the EU is not, technically speaking, binding on the government. Under UK law, a referendum is only considered to be advisory, but it's difficult to see how any politician can ignore this result. And a lot of them seem to be noticeably rattled, with their confidence in their ability to lead the public and to predict the future significantly undermined. So, what happens now? Well, under Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, an EU member state is allowed 2 years to negotiate an exit from the organisation, and the countdown begins when it formally declares its intention. The referendum itself does not provide legal notification. Given the likely complexity of the negotiations, 2 years to complete them actually seems to be very ambitious. There is provision in the treaty for the deadline to be extended, but that can only happen if all EU states agree that it can. I think it's likely that all parties will want to conclude the negotiation as quickly as possible, and an extension of the deadline is not something that we can rely upon. And certainly senior members of the EU organisation, Schulz, Tusk, Rutte and Juncker, have issued a joint statement saying they want to conclude the matter as quickly as it can be arranged. They emphasise the need for certainty after a very long period of doubt. The UK Leave campaign, on the other hand, have emphasised that they would actually prefer to go at a much more deliberate pace and try and get the negotiations right first time. And I think this gives us some glimpse of the differing objectives and the differing styles of the various parties involved. The long-term outcome of independence for the UK will depend on the position that these European leaders choose to adopt in negotiation, and it's not certain that they're going to be accommodating towards the UK. There's a lot of other EU nations out there that have significant Eurosceptic movements, and these movements may gain inspiration and they may gain credibility as the UK moves towards exit. We may even see further referenda. Now, we can see from this data, which is provided by the Pew Research Centre in the USA, that actually the UK is not the most Eurosceptic nation in Europe. Even France is noticeably more Eurosceptic than we are in this country. Now, the EU already faces a wide range of different and very difficult challenges, and further exits could potentially cause the whole structure to collapse. So I think there would be an understandable desire amongst EU leaders to play very hard to drive a tough bargain in order to perhaps discourage any further secession. Before those negotiations can even begin, the UK has to address sudden political shifts, and until that's done, it's not even clear who is actually going to represent the UK in the negotiation process. The leaders of all the major UK political parties adopted a very pro-UK stance in the run-up to the referendum, and their view on that matter was clearly in opposition to the view taken by the majority of voters, and this does create a sense of tension around at least some of the senior personalities. So I think we have to expect there's going to be a certain amount of change at senior levels within the major parties. The complexion of government and the complexion of the legislature itself might shift dramatically before Article 50 is even invoked. That might well take a form of further political polarisation or an erosion of the political consensus. I think we're also going to see continued pressure from nationalist parties in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. That will only complicate matters further. Another question to consider is who exactly is going to be doing the negotiating on behalf of the UK. We know, for example, that the UK has not carried out independent trade negotiations for decades. It was always done on our behalf by the EU. So as we go into the negotiations, it may be that the UK team has much less experience than their EU counterparts. And as negotiation gets underway, the UK team is going to need a lot of advice and a lot of support from the business community. For example, businesses may have to get behind them and say, we represent the food industry and these are the things we need you guys to achieve in the exit deal. That's not really something that IGD can cover because we're a charity and we cannot be political. So other trade organisations or other business leaders might have to fill that gap. The negotiation project itself is going to be absolutely huge because there's an awful lot of ground that has to be covered. As of March 2015, there are more than 130,000 EU-originated laws and regulations of various kinds. Now, some of these will simply lapse automatically as we leave the EU. So a lot of regulations around things like product standards will simply fall away once we're no longer EU members. But a lot of EU laws have been incorporated into UK jurisprudence, and those laws are not going to lapse automatically. Neither will things like case law, court verdicts, that sort of thing. There's going to have to be a certain amount of probably rather tedious legal unpicking as we leave the European structure. EU policy actually overlaps with the food industry in a whole series of places. That's simply a reflection of the original role of the EU. The EU was designed from the outset with the aim of developing food sustainability and food security for the European continent. So it's no surprise that EU policy overlaps at every stage in the grocery supply chain. So as we leave the EU, our industry, the grocery industry, is going to find itself very much at the front line of change. And remember, there may be as little as 2 years for us to prepare for this. Now, you might remember that in January of 2016, the Secretary of State, Liz Truss, hit the headlines in the trade press when she was speaking at the Oxford Farming Conference. She said at that moment that her department, DEFRA, the department which is responsible for agriculture and food, had no current plans for coping with Brexit. Now, as it turns out, that wasn't entirely correct. There were some contingency plans in place, but it is evident that contingency planning is incomplete, and an awful lot of detail is going to have to be filled in as we go forward. If that position is actually typical of other government departments as well, there may well be a large policy gap in government. It's not clear, for example, what's going to happen to plans like the food and farming strategy or the childhood obesity strategy, which the food industry has already been warned to expect. Those policies might have to be rewritten or may at least be greatly delayed. So businesses might actually find themselves left in a state of limbo, if you like, awaiting policy guidance from the government before they can make major decisions. Now, Donald Tusk of the European Council has actually issued a statement in the last couple of days saying that he at least is ready for exit. He has his plans in place, his contingencies are prepared, and that does suggest that the European Council at least is well prepared for the negotiation process. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I might be wrong, but I suspect an awful lot of UK grocery businesses are in a fairly similar position to the UK government. Over the last couple of months, Brexit seemed to be a very unlikely outcome, and investing a lot of effort in detailed planning might have appeared to be very wasteful. But now, of course, businesses have to make policy. They have to make policy on the fly, if you like. And that's one reason why IGD is releasing its information promptly and free of charge. But I think we have to recognise that policy that is developed in a hurry is unlikely to be right the first go, especially as solid information, solid guidance is absent. So I think one approach that businesses might want to adopt is to consider a range of possible negotiation outcomes and to start to develop a number of possible strategic responses. And I'll show you some examples of this later on in the presentation. So, political outcomes still very, very unclear. Political outcomes will shape economic outcomes and therefore also shape the commercial landscape that grocery businesses have to operate in. There are a huge number of macroeconomic variables out there that could be influential. I've listed just a few of them on this screen here. We'll await guidance from credible sources such as the Bank of England or the Office for Budget Responsibility, and then we'll start revisiting our market forecast for the UK and for other European countries. Grocery businesses, I'm sure, are going to be doing much the same thing. So they'll be awaiting guidance from government and then rebuilding their business plans and, just as importantly, restating their performance targets for the next couple of years. As I say, there are lots of potential economic levers that could affect business performance, but I suspect that interest rates could be the most important factor. We don't really think about interest rates very much at the moment because base rates have been so low for so long. They've been at record lows for more than 7 years, and monetary policy has been incredibly accommodative. Now, I think we can expect this very loose monetary policy to continue, with the Bank of England doing whatever it can to support demand and support trading as we go through the transition period. And I think we could probably expect the same from other central banks as well. So central banks like the Fed might actually be using Brexit as a reason to continue with very loose monetary policy. But even though the base rates are going to stay low, the retail interest rates offered by banks to commercial or to private borrowers may go up. Lenders will obviously want higher profits if they believe that the risk is going up. And I think that's going to be very damaging to anybody who's got a large outstanding debt. So if you're a homeowner, for example, with a large outstanding mortgage, a small increase in the interest rate could actually completely hamstring your household finances, especially if the value of the house goes down as well. The cost of things like trade credit insurance, that might also go up in the aftermath of the referendum, and that could leave vendors with some quite interesting tactical decisions to make. Do they want to pay the extra for the insurance that they want, or do you want to just do business without it and risk it, if you like? We can make similar points about interest rates around the question of sovereign debt. The UK government currently has a very large sovereign debt, and its financial plan is built on the assumption of continued EU membership. The cost of borrowing and the cost of servicing existing debt may well go up outside the EU, especially if sterling weakens as well. And that would create significant fiscal stress with the need to raise taxes or reduce spending further. That would mean direct impacts on individuals, such as reduced welfare spending, or direct impacts on businesses, such as higher business tax or higher rates. Population change is another really important influence on economic outcomes. Put simply, more people means more financial transactions and therefore more economic growth, more economic activity. This forecast here shows anticipated population change in the UK, assuming continued EU membership. It comes from the latest UN population census that was carried out in 2015. Notice that what we're looking at here is number of people added to the UK population, not total UK population. So we can see that the population was expected to continue growing right up to the end of the 21st century. But the rate of growth slows and the mechanism also shifts. So net immigration, that's the red section, gradually takes over from natural change as the population growth driver. If you're in the food industry, population growth is probably a good thing. It's supportive of volume demand. It's more mouths to feed, although yes, it does increase your sustainability problems. Immigration also really useful as far as government is concerned, because the arrival of new young taxpayers helps to offset the cost of an ageing indigenous population. Future population movements are therefore going to be very influential of the long-term performance of UK grocery businesses and the UK government. Any new limits on migration would certainly cause population to grow more slowly than was previously expected. And even if borders stay completely open, it's not certain that the UK will be just as attractive to migrants post-exit as it has been pre-exit. Those migrants, of course, come to the UK to work. Right now, about 3.3 million jobs in the UK are held by foreign nationals. Those amount to 11% of all employment in the UK. And of those, about 2/3 are originating from the EU. That's the blue section, the blue bars on the chart. These workers work at all levels in the UK grocery supply chain, and there are specific functions like agriculture, manufacturing, food services that are especially reliant on these EU migrant workers. Now no one, or at least no one credible, has suggested that existing migrant workers will be repatriated post-exit. However, their legal status may well change, and that would create a paperwork problem for them and for their employers. And some might choose to simply go home or to move on to some other European countries. Recruiting new migrant workers, well, that could prove to be a much bigger challenge depending on the rules that are adopted post-exit. It is conceivable, at least, that rules will be relaxed in some areas, so it might be easier to recruit beyond Europe than it is now. However, a general tightening of immigration policy would create real challenges for employers in grocery and in other industries as well. So we have to await guidance on that. Hopefully that will be issued fairly soon. The other big question mark affecting UK grocery is, of course, trade. The current structure of the industry is based on an assumption of open trade right across the whole continent. Even the smallest UK grocery businesses now have logistical chains that extend across borders, and any disruption of those arrangements could be potentially very damaging indeed. Post-exit, we'll probably have to have some form of trading relationship with our neighbours, and a number of possible outcomes have been suggested, as shown here. The final outcome, of course, will depend on the attitude taken by our negotiating partners. Now, this is why trade terms are so critical to our industry. You can see from this chart that the UK is not self-sufficient when it comes to food and drink. In the latest year, we've imported 39% of the food eaten, and even for the food that we can produce in the UK, we imported about 24%. The import of indigenous type foods might be driven by a series of different things like price or season availability or branding, that sort of thing. Making use of overseas supply is not necessarily a bad thing. Having an alternative source would contribute to food security for the UK, and it makes no sense for us to grow at home what we can simply buy in much more cheaply from somewhere else. But maintaining this inbound food trade, and just as importantly maintaining it on favourable terms, is critical. That is important for us to do as we seek to protect the interests of UK shoppers. And this is probably a good opportunity for us to make another subsidiary point. Now, the UK food industry is generally very robust and very flexible. It's shown an ability to absorb a whole series of supply side shocks, things like BSE or foot and mouth or Sudan 1, that sort of thing. But the decision to leave the EU could be different, because it will affect all grocery markets simultaneously, and that might be much harder to swallow than any shocks that we've seen up to this point. The trade in groceries is not a one-way business, of course. This chart is based on the latest information from HMRC, and it looks at the latest year. We can take several learnings from this. First of all, if we look at goods overall, not just grocery goods but all goods, imports exceed exports, and that's not unusual. The UK has a consistent trade deficit when it comes to goods, and that means that wealth drains out of the UK each year, and our economic activity has to make up that loss, or the UK will get weaker and weaker as time goes on. The second point is that exports to the rest of the world actually outweigh exports to the EU. And again, this is fairly typical. 2015 wasn't an unusual year. The UK has been growing exports beyond the EU for some time. Third, grocery imports worth around £36 billion in 2015, of which 26 billion came from the EU. Grocery exports worth 17 billion per year, and again most of that was to the EU. That food trade deficit is again fairly typical, fairly unsurprising given what I showed on the previous chart. Notice that the value of grocery trading varies a little bit from year to year depending on currency and global commodity price changes. If we draw on the same source, we can see that the importance of the EU as a source of food imports is rising slowly. If you follow the red line, you can see it slopes upwards from left to right. And it's not clear why this should be, but it might indicate a gradual running down of some elements of domestic food production. So fruit production, for example, has been gradually run down over many years in favour of imported sources. The UK share, so EU share of all UK grocery exports is much more static. You'll see there's a small hump in the middle of the blue line over the course of 2007-2009. It's not clear what was going on there, but it may be associated with global food price changes that occurred at that time. Now clearly what this data is showing us is that UK grocery businesses are very closely entwined with counterparties in Europe, and that goes well beyond the import and export of just food and drink. There's trade in other items, things like machinery or vehicles or packaging, spare parts, professional services. That's also incredibly significant for our industry, and successful completion of trade talks in food and the associated areas is going to be critical to many and probably most UK grocery businesses. If we delve into that trade data in a bit more detail, we can see that trade is very concentrated. Most of our food trade is occurring with just a few key partners, and geography is probably a key factor in that. The top 5 destinations account for 76% of our grocery exports to Europe, and the top 5 origin countries account for 68% of our grocery imports. Again, you can see these are countries that are close by the UK on the map. These countries, of course, are also quite heavily reliant on us as a trading partner, particularly Ireland. The UK's decision to leave the EU may be causing these countries some alarm, and businesses in those countries might actually prove to be our allies as the UK tries to create a trade deal for a post-Brexit world. Similarly, our external trade is quite concentrated in terms of the products which are being bought and sold. UK export products are skewed heavily towards beverages, particularly whisky. That could help to explain why it is that Scotland was noticeably pro-EU when the referendum was voted. Many rural Scottish communities are very reliant on whisky and other food and drink production. The imports to the UK from the EU dominated by fresh produce, particularly in the winter months. That helps to support the level of choice and the level of availability that British shoppers have become used to. Clearly, whatever happens in the future, things are going to be incredibly interesting and incredibly exciting. Nobody can tell at this stage what the future holds, so analysing and planning is extremely difficult. What I've done, therefore, is to create a few slides with alternative narratives which will show the range of outcomes that might come from Brexit, and I'll rip through these pretty quickly with just a few comments. Firstly, general economic performance post-Brexit. As I said, that's going to depend on a number of different factors: population, sterling value, interest rates, fiscal impacts. Those things will all be important, but the performance of the city will be especially influential. The city is a key driver of overall GDP performance and a key provider of tax revenue. we've already seen a strong response from investors in the financial markets to news of Brexit. And that response has spread worldwide, as we've seen in other major recent events, such as the credit crunch. So the Brexit is not going to impact just the UK. It's also going to affect other markets as well, especially, as I said, Ireland. After that, we might see things starting to calm down a bit as people get used to the new situation and start to look for risk opportunities. Food is a central competence of the EU. And in fact, developing food policy for the whole continent was one reason why the EU was founded. So the food supply chain would be right on the front line of change in a post-Exit scenario. The UK overlaps with the food supply chain in lots of different ways, but the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, is especially important. The CAP, which is a subsidy programme, and to a lesser extent the Common Fisheries Policy, underpin the whole food and drink structure. In the current model, subsidy is orientated towards sustainability rather than production. But subsidy is still a very large part of farm income in the UK. Exclusion from the CAP implies that the subsidies that many farmers rely on could be withdrawn. And unless they were replaced by a UK-only regime, some sort of financial effect on farmers seems to be inevitable. And farmers would continue to face very tough competition from their EU rivals, who of course would retain the benefit of a subsidy programme. Now of course, subsidy is not an EU monopoly. Most countries have some form of agricultural subsidy scheme, so it's reasonable to expect that an independent UK would offer farmers something at least. And it's even possible that a UK-only scheme would be better targeted and more efficient than what we have at the moment. Labour movement. That's a key force that drives population change and therefore overall economic performance. And as we've said, our own industry is very reliant on this labour movement. It's providing not only huge numbers of new consumers, but also huge numbers of skilled and willing workers as well. And those workers are now embedded at all level within the system. Exiting the UK doesn't mean those workers will be sent home. And it doesn't even mean that further recruitment would be blocked. An independent UK can suit itself. However, some aspects of the immigration policy would surely change. It's also worth considering whether foreign workers want to continue being here when other destinations might prove to be more attractive or more welcoming. But either of the outcomes that I've put up here will mean that businesses need to focus on skills and recruitment, and that certainly works with the grain of IGD's current research and activity programme, which is very focused on human resource issues. Laws, regulation and red tape generally. These are all bugbears for the pro-Brexit camp. Leaving the EU is seen by some as a means of freeing up businesses from admin burdens. Now, if this could be achieved, it would create competitive benefits, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. And it would also give the UK a chance to develop its own regulatory approach. That could be more appropriate or more flexible lawmaking. In practice, though, I do wonder whether the benefit of that would be quite muted. Nothing would happen at once, even in the best case. Yet the established rules would have to be unpicked slowly. And businesses that want to operate in Europe would still have to abide by EU rules. So it would make sense to abide by whatever rules were the most onerous. And let's face it, in many ways the UK is already a good place to do business. Studies like the World Bank Doing Business Index actually give us a consistently high score. In the EU, only Denmark scored higher in the latest study. So it's not clear how much more competitive advantage we might get from independence and a reduction in the regulatory load. And finally, the big one, terms of trade. This is something that's going to affect all UK businesses, since all of them are importers or exporters, whether directly or indirectly. The creation of the single EU market for goods, and to some extent for services as well, is a key achievement of the EU. Right now we're in a really good position to do business with the EU, especially with basically open borders. We saw lots of alternative trade scenarios for a post-Brexit EU, but really most of these would involve some sort of increase in the cost and the complexity of trading. and that would limit economic growth and possibly drive up inflation. That said, there are lots of countries out there that do business successfully even on fairly unfavourable trade terms or outside free market structures. So it's not necessarily a problem that's insoluble, but it's probably not a problem that businesses will welcome. A lot, of course, as I said, will depend on the view taken by the remaining EU members. They're very likely to feel quite torn, I think. On the one hand, there is a strong case for them leaving the channels of trade open because trade is good for everybody. But on the other hand, they might want to impose some sort of sanction. Otherwise, being within the EU wouldn't feel very special for the members that are left. It should be obvious that by now that exit from the EU is going to create enormous uncertainty and therefore risk, both upside and downside risk. Almost all of the assumptions that business plans have been built on have now been thrown into question. And in fact, if I had to sum up this presentation in just one sentence, it would be this: all bets are now off. And with risk ongoing, the only advice I can offer is stay alert and stay agile. But not all of that risk will be downside risk. There could well be big opportunities available despite all of the doom and gloom. So for example, small local UK food companies might actually do better and find new opportunities to thrive if trade with their rivals on the European continent becomes more difficult post-exit. And this is the last slide I'm going to show you before I sum up. Although we're now focused on Brexit, we can't take our eyes off the other potential risks that are out there. There's an awful lot of possible shock events out there that could impact overall economic performance, and I've tried to classify them here according to likelihood and possible impact. Layered on top of those general issues, the food system itself faces its own separate set of issues, things like loss of pollinating insects, soil degradation, that sort of thing. Most of these events are unfortunately likely to be net negative, although some are arguable, and in most cases severity will vary very widely. Right, that's all I have time for now. I'm going to leave you with this final slide with just a few things to think about over the course of the next couple of days. Those all follow the order of a narrative, so hopefully those make sense. I'd like to say thank you very much from IGD for taking the time to listen to this presentation. We hope that you found it valuable, and if you have any questions or any comments, please do get in touch with our customer support staff. Thank you very much.